Boxie, Boxie, we're live. Isn't that exciting? I know. It's super, super exciting. Welcome, everybody. This is the monthly Ask Me Everything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel. I do it on the third Tuesday of the month. It is only George Hodel and Steve Hodel. No Black Dahlia questions otherwise. I started doing the Ask Me Anything because I got fed up with the true crime industrial complex. And so that's why I started doing these. And I'm a lot happier. I don't do interviews anymore. This is it. And I got so many Steve Hodel and George Hodel questions that I split them off into another Ask Me Anything. So Black Dahlia, Ask Me Anything is the first Tuesday of the month. George Hodel, Steve Hodel is the third Tuesday of the month. And we have Vince, we have Spins and Needles. Hello, Spins and Needles. Hello, Eugene. Great, we're going to have fun. This will be a good session, I hope. I always hope for that. The time goes quickly. Oh, Helen, thank you for joining us all the way from Australia. This is great, thank you. Okay, people are showing up, so let's get going. I am Larry Harnisch, and this is Boxie. Boxie is the Los Angeles County District Attorney's files in the Black Dahlia case. Now, this is not everything that the grand jury looked at the time. It's only Black Dahlia stuff, and that's it. Okay, that's important to note. This is the Ask Me Anything on George Hodel and Steve Hodel. As I said, chat is on super slow to inhibit trolls. I usually get some. I will report any harassment immediately. Anybody else, feel free to report harassment as well. Okay, who am I? Who am I? I'm Larry Harnisch. I have been fact-checking Steve Hodel since publication of Black Dahlia Avenger in 2003. And I don't know everything that Steve Hodel says. He has devoted the last 21 years of his life to establishing his father as a prolific serial killer and criminal genius who just sort of shape-shifted himself all over the world to commit famous murders. George Hodel only did famous unsolved murders. The little ones, he didn't do those. And I will tell you, as I do every time, Steve Hodel lies. He lies all the time. He lies about absolutely everything. The average person who doesn't know anything about the Black Dahlia case, who doesn't know anything about law enforcement, who doesn't know anything about the history of Los Angeles, who doesn't know anything about the court system or the legal system or the medical profession or the art world, all these specialties, if you don't know in some detail those fields, it might make sense. But if you know about that, you will be staggered. It's staggering how much he lies. You just cannot imagine how he is able to get away with so much. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. These are good examples. Steve likes to say, and I have heard him say it many, many, many times on podcasts, that he remembers swank cocktail parties at the Soudan House when he was a kid. Okay? No, he doesn't remember that. He will tell you that he remembers the swank cocktail parties with a who's who of Hollywood and all this sort of thing. No, he doesn't remember that. It's all imaginary. It is part of this parallel universe that Steve Hodel has constructed. Now, Larry Harnisch, how can you be so sure that Steve is making this up? Well, we know that Steve was born in 1941. Okay. Steve's parents split up in 1944, was the preliminary divorce, and the final divorce was in 1945 when Steve was 3 or 4 years old. So no, he wasn't living there. He wasn't living at the Soudan House. Steve was living with his mom and his brothers, wherever she could find a place to stay. Now, we do know, because we have her letters to John Huston that are in the Motion Picture Academy library, where she's asking John Huston for money. We know that Dorothy and the three boys were at the Soudan House for a while in desperation, I think in 1950. But Dorothy makes it clear from her letters that they are unwelcome. It's a very uncomfortable situation. So, no, Steve does not remember the glittery cocktail parties at the Soudan House because it's all up here. It didn't really happen. Another thing Steve does, just to show you how willing he is to lie, he will say that it's in Boxie here, in the transcripts of the George Hodel bug. George Hodel's house was bugged for about 5.5 weeks. And in the course of that transcript, which are in Boxie, a technician says, because they're recording it, he says he's having trouble with the equipment. And he's had trouble with one reel. Okay, that's the technician talking. I had trouble with one reel. That's not a good enough for Steve Hodel. He will take that and turn that into a quote from his dad saying, I'm in trouble. No, his father never said that. It didn't happen. It is a guy saying, I had trouble with the equipment. And Steve turns that into, I'm in trouble. No, the average person who doesn't know all this stuff cannot imagine. You really can't imagine how much he lies. So that's just kind of the basis. You just need to know how untrustworthy he is. Okay. First order of business before I open for questions is this: public service announcement. There are no hidden messages, no encoded communiques or encrypted communiques in the mail that was sent to the newspapers and the police after the murder of Elizabeth Short. There are no coded messages. There aren't any. How can I say that? Because the only authenticated communication was the very first envelope that arrived. It was addressed with cut out letters and contained material from her purse. That's it. All the rest are generally from crackpots and cranks. There's one or two letters that I think were from people who were trying to help but wanted to stay anonymous. But all the rest were pranksters and hoaxes. And why do I say this? Why am I saying this? Because I got another email from an individual who had spent years first of all, examining all the Zodiac messages. And I'm not going to get into Zodiac. Zodiac did send coded messages. That's a completely different thing. But this individual had decided that based on the Zodiac messages that there were similarities between the Zodiac messages and what Steve claims are the Black Dahlia Avenger messages, and therefore his father was Zodiac. Okay, no, none of that's true. That's all nonsense. But anyway, and what always happens is when I tell these individuals, no, you haven't solved any coded messages because there aren't any coded messages to find. Would you believe it? They get upset. Yes, they don't want to be told that, no, you wasted your time. And the last individual, I said, look, I'm 72 years old, which is true. I'm 72 years old. My time is one of my most precious possessions. You are free to waste your time any way you want to, but don't waste my time. But it is amazing to me that people will decide that they can find coded messages in all these letters. And the last individual said, oh, this is unprecedented. And it's like, no, it's not. It is a thing in American society if there's a big murder case or a big kidnapping, to send crackpot mail to the police and the newspapers. Great example is the Lindbergh kidnapping. There was hundreds. If you go back and look at the newspaper coverage, there were hundreds of crackpot letters sent to the newspapers and the police. It's not unprecedented. It is what human beings do. So no, you didn't find any coded messages. There are no coded messages to find. And thinking that you found a coded message it's a ticket to Crazytown. It's just there is nothing to find. So that's the end of my public service announcement. The other thing I want to talk about is there was an article recently by a man who presents himself as a retired judge, retired prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, and I don't know, appellate jurist or something like that. and he likes to dabble in history. And he is writing about. He's sort of dabbling in, history and true crime. His name's R. Mark Kantrowitz, and I was going to put the link to his article in the YouTube description. It's paywalled, although I got through to it yesterday, and it's generally about Gene Spangler. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on Gene Spangler. That is a whole different case that isn't related to the Black Dahlia. But you get a couple paragraphs in, and retired prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, appellate jurist, whatever he was, R. Mark Kantrowitz says, oh, Elizabeth Short knew Gene Spangler because Gene Spangler worked at the Florentine Gardens, and Elizabeth Short worked there as a waitress in 1947. Okay, no, that didn't happen. First of all, Elizabeth Short never worked as a waitress at the Florentine Gardens, certainly not in 1947 when she was dead. That didn't happen. And it is shocking to me that because the publication is called NC Lawyers Weekly, so this is a publication that's a subscription publication for attorneys that is so poorly researched. And generally what R. Mark Kantrowitz has done has scraped the internet and gotten a lot of facts wrong. And of course he ends up with George Hodel, and he just regurgitates all of Steve Hodel's claims. And I hope that someone with those kind of credentials, assuming that they're legit, would be more diligent in research than just recycling a bunch of stuff off the internet. So that is my rant on that. I will try to post the link. I don't know. As I said, it's paywall, but I got through yesterday, so I don't know. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to rant and rave about this morning. So I'm going to open it up for the Q&A. And let's see, I've got Instagram going over here. Instagram folks, I don't know how to add you to my video. I have never figured out how to do that. Apologies. I don't know how. I don't normally do the only time I do live videos on Instagram is this, so I don't know how. But let's go over to the chat, folks, and see. Cowpoke, I wonder if there were a few moments of glitter Hodel remembers from that house, but he drastically embellishes it. Steve was living with his mom and his brothers. He was the middle of three brothers. Older one was Michael, middle was Steve, and a twin who died in infancy, and then a younger brother, Kelvin. And Steve was born in 1941, so he would have been 3 when his folks got the interlocutory divorce, and then the final divorce was in 45, when he would have been maybe 4. So what children remember from 4 years old is not a heck of a lot. It really is fantasy when you listen to Steve's descriptions of it on the podcast. But he never gets into it. He'll never say, oh, well, Gary Cooper was there or Clark Gable or anything like that. He'll just say it was a who's who of Hollywood. There's no details on that. And I have gone through the newspapers as much as I can researching Dr. Hodel. And you have to remember there were 4 major and some minor papers in Los Angeles at the time. And they all had society columns. They all had society writers who wrote about, who reported on who was at this party, who was at that party, who was at this nightclub, who was at that nightclub. This stuff was all written up. Certainly anything of the caliber that Steve Hodel describes, that would have landed in the paper somewhere. No, it's not there. As I said, it is all imaginary. I think in lieu of what was a pretty bleak childhood, the actual childhood of Steve and his brothers with his mom is not pretty. She wasn't working. She was an alcoholic. She kept getting arrested, which we know because it was written up in the newspapers. Children's author arrested, generally children's author arrested for neglecting her kids, that kind of thing. She was in, let's see, she was charged multiple times with child neglect and put on probation and eventually went to jail for neglecting Steve and his brothers. That is the real story. It is not at all the glittery cocktail parties and the who's who of Hollywood. It's a pretty bleak childhood with an alcoholic mom. And I think the mom used the Sowden house as a mail drop from time to time because she had no fixed address. And indeed, and it's in here, when Frank Jimison went to interview her, she was living over a bait shop on Santa Monica Pier, not at the Sowden. That didn't happen. But when you listen to Steve, he will say, oh yeah, we were living at the Sowden house and dad was the king and mom was the queen and we were the three princes. And then, one weekend he killed Elizabeth Short. It's like, none of that happened. None of that happened. He'll say everything was going swimmingly until there was a knock on the door and it was no, none of that happened. That is all imaginary. Okay. Now I got a question here by Instagram, which says, in an interview for South Pasadena News, Steve Hodel's brother Kelvin said about their father, George Hodel, my father was taking us to the homes of women he was having sex with and leaving us out in the car for 2 or 3 hours. That was definitely abuse. Do you think George Hodel was abusive towards his children? Well, that's actually two questions. First of all, and this is really important, whenever somebody in the Hodel family says, I remember, that should launch 1,000 red flags because they don't remember that. It's like Steve remembering the glittery cocktail parties at the Sowden house. He doesn't remember that. When you have Tamar, the whole Tamar branch of the family, Tamar, Steve's older half-sister, who was a piece of work, Tamar, and then her daughter Fauna, and then Fauna's kids, Rasha and Yvette. When you get into that whole branch of the family saying, I remember, okay, that's red flags. Anytime they say they remember something, it's like run. But let's talk about Kelvin for a minute. Remember, Steve Hodel was born in 41, pardon me. Steve Hodel was born in 1941. His older brother was Michael, who had some reputation here in LA as a disc jockey and a radio announcer. And then you had his younger brother, Kelvin. Now, his real name is George Kelvin Hodel, but he dropped George. I don't know why. I can guess. But anyway, he goes by Kelvin or Kel. And Kelvin Hodel was born in 1942. So let's look at our timeline. Kelvin's born in 1942. The parents get the interlocutory divorce in 1944. Kelvin is 2 years old. They get the final divorce in 1943. Kelvin is 3 years old. So what does Kelvin remember from 3 years old? In addition to that, if you're going to say, well, he remembers that, it's like, okay, what does a child remember from that age? What's going to seem like 2 or 3 hours to a kid who is 5 or 6 years old, that may not really be 2 or 3 hours. It could be 20 minutes, if it happened at all. And I'm not convinced that I'm not even convinced that it happened, because as I said, anytime one of the Hodels say, I remember, it's like, no, they don't remember. In terms of the other question, was George Hodel abusive towards his children? I don't really have enough information to know that. I'm not sure how you would know that. And abusive, I don't know. Abuse can take so many forms: physical abuse, emotional abuse. I think George screwed up, and this is appropriate coming close to Father's Day. He didn't seem to take a lot of interest in his kids. George Hodel had a lot of kids, and he didn't seem to take a lot of interest in any of them. which is, I don't get. I mean, I will never understand why George Hodel didn't get custody of Steve and his two brothers, and leave him with this negligent boozer mom. I don't get that, which is what happened. That is something I will never understand. But he did. But that's what happened. So I think in terms of neglect, I think you can say he was not interested in being a dad. There is this letter from Dorothy Hodel. There's a number of letters. Dorothy Hodel, just to back up a little bit, Steve's mom was married to John Huston and divorced, I think, in the 30s. And so, but there are letters in the John Huston papers at the Motion Picture Academy that she writes to John Huston, generally asking for money. She will come up with some sort of flaky ideas for screenplays or radio plays or stuff like that. But generally, she's kind of hinting around that things are bad. And so it's hard to know exactly how much she's dramatizing things. But when she talks about them being back at the Sowden house, mostly she says that Steve and his brothers can't go outside because the neighbors are pissed at George because of his trial, even though he was found not guilty. I'm not sure if George would have been like physically abusive in some way. I think you almost have to be in the family to know that. And unfortunately, Steve is so unreliable, you can't take his word on anything. I think for sure George Hodel was neglectful. Yeah, but in terms of being abusive, that's a tougher call. That's kind of a non-answer, but that's the best I've got for you. And again, George was in Hawaii by 1951 when Kelvin would have been about like 8. So all of those memories are pretty vague. Let's see. I've got a question over here on Instagram. Do you know what kind of detective Steve was? Have you ever talked to any of his peers when he was on homicide? Thank you for asking. I get that question occasionally. Now, I have talked to people who worked with Steve, and their take on Steve was that he was an okay detective with a drinking problem. That's what I have been told, literally word for word. Now, after publication of this, Steve's a pariah. He's an outcast. And if you talk to any of the current, anybody who's currently within the LAPD, they have nothing good to say about him at all. But at the time, and I forget when. I think he retired in the 80s. I'm relying on my memory here. But his reputation was an okay detective with a drinking problem. Now, recently, I came across a very interesting article about Detective Hodel, and he is working on a dead body, and it's an interesting portrait. It's a 2-part story. It's pretty good, but assuming that the author did a competent job, the reporter profiling Detective Hodel when he is working in Hollywood homicide portrays Steve as a thoughtful, reflective, patient individual, deliberate, very slow to make any kind of decisions. And the backstory is, and I'm relying on my memory, so I don't recall the name of the victim, or no, I take that back. The name of the victim and the name of the suspect were changed in the story. Okay, that's why I don't remember. Anyway, the situation is this. A woman collapses. She lives with her son. And the son has some medical training, EMT training, that kind of thing. He tries to revive his mother. He can't do it. He calls the paramedics. The paramedics show up. They try to revive her. They have some problems with that. They transport her to a hospital where she dies. And so the coroner calls, as they would, the coroner calls downtown RHD and says, hey, we've got this lady who died under mysterious circumstances out in Hollywood. Can you take a look at it? What do you think? And RHD says, well, you know what? It happened in Hollywood. Why don't you pass it off to Hollywood Division, which they do. And so Detective Hodel gets the assignment. And he and his partner go out to this apartment house that's kind of funky. And I think it's about 2 a.m. at this place. And the son has a record for going after official people, firefighters and stuff like that. So Detective Hodel asks for backup. So they have some uniform patrol guys go out with Steve and his partner, and they knock on the door, and it's like 2 a.m. and the son says, what's up? And so Detective Hodel interviews the guy. He says basically what I told you. And Steve says, okay, let's go down to the station. So they take him down. They transport him down to Hollywood Division. And he okays a search of the apartment, which, if you're a suspect in a murder, you might want to be a little bit careful about just saying, oh, yeah, you can search for the apartment. And you might want to be careful about talking to the police without an attorney. But the guy doesn't do that. Anyway, so he says, yeah, my mom and I fought, but this is what happened, blah, 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 blah. And Detective Hodel, he's smoking Pall Malls, and he's drinking black coffee from a thermos and all this kind of stuff. And the upshot is, okay, he gets a call from the coroner who does the autopsy. And they say the mom died of, and I forget, it was natural causes. She had a heart attack or a cerebral hemorrhage. I forget. Again, I'm relying on my memory, so I don't recall. But any bruising or whatever that they found was incidental. It did not cause her death. She collapsed of natural causes, and that was it. End of story. And so the wrap up is, well, it's another day in homicide at the LAPD, and you just have to be patient and deliberate and all that kind of thing, which is totally. That's not the Steve Hodel you get a Black Dahlia Avenger. Now it's thought prints, and I recognize my father's handwriting, and he just jumps at everything. But it's an interesting profile, and I'm kind of surprised that Steve has never republished it because he likes to republish things. But it's a good story, and I don't remember the exact date now. I believe it was in the Herald Examiner. I think it's a little hard to find, but it's worth a read if you can find it. So again, what his peers say, an okay detective with a drinking problem, and I think Steve is pretty open about his drinking issues. But this profile is really interesting just to show a different, because it's not the Steve Hodel you get now at all. It's somebody who is deliberate and thoughtful and patient and all that kind of thing. Okay, let's see. Do I have any more written questions? Let's see. Any over here? Is anyone else trying to expose Steve Hodel for fraud, the fraud he is besides you? There are a few. And, it's an uphill fight, Eugene. It is an uphill fight to expose Steve Hodel. Retired homicide detectives says dead dad is serial killer is a terrific elevator pitch. I will say that I monitor social media to some extent. I like to see what's going on, and obviously it's humanly impossible to monitor all of social media, but what I find, for example, in Reddit is far less supportive of George Hodel and Steve Hodel, far more skeptical of Steve Hodel. and far more dismissive of Steve Hodel than the published articles. You read the comments on Reddit about Steve, and they are not at all supportive. They laugh about him. It's, you know, and I've said this before. The Zodiac people. I mean, if you think I'm tough on Steve, you should see what the Zodiac people have to say. They're brutal. The Zodiac people are really brutal, and I'm, in comparison, as tough as I am. There's so, you know, but there are a few people in terms of actually doing the deep dive, researching the life of George Hodel, independently of what Steve says, is a lot of pick and shovel work. You have to really, really, really be willing to dig. And there are a couple of people, I know of a couple of people who are willing to do that, but it takes a lot of time. You know, and anybody who is, and you know who you are, fact checking Steve Hodel, it's a lot of work. You know, and he has just tainted the whole landscape with his stuff, which is why, if you're a retired judge who likes to dabble in history, you can just scrape something off the internet about George Hodel being a suspect in the death of Gene Spangler, and it's like, no. As a matter of fact, and this is one of the things that got me about former prosecutor, defense attorney, Judge R. Mark Kantrowitz. He doesn't get into at all the weeds about how, well, Gene Spangler disappeared on such and such a date, and George Hodel had been, arrested the day before, and Steve has to do some very fancy footwork to get his dad out of jail in time to, disappear Gene Spangler when he's presumably under observation under surveillance by the police, if he's even out of jail. We don't know. And in Steve world, why would George Hodel, off Gene Spangler? Well, she knew too much. That is Steve Hodel's answer on everything, is they knew too much. And there's nothing to support any connection at all between Gene Spangler and George Hodel. Zero. Nothing. He wasn't a suspect. And I might add, George Hodel was also never a suspect in the death of his secretary. That has become lore in Steve world. But no, the secretary committed suicide. We have her death certificate. It says right on there, Sue is side. Period. She took an overdose of sleeping pills, and that's it. So no, he was never a suspect. No, that's all Steve world. But again, that doesn't matter. If you're a retired judge who dabbles in history, you're just gonna scrape something off the internet and sell it as filler to some legal publication. So okay, let's see, Andre. Do you think the Steve we see now is an act, or is it real? Andre, that's a good question. Thank you for asking. My best impression is that Steve wrote Black Dahlia Avenger as a scam. He knew it was a fraud. He knew it was a fake. And how can I say that with such assurance? Steve wrote Black Dahlia Avenger in total secrecy. He didn't tell anybody what he was doing. Not the people in the family who were furious when the book came out. No, they didn't know. He never went to the LAPD to ask to see his dad's file before writing the book. I had Brian Carr, who was custodian of the Black Dahlia case at the time, said, Hodel never came to me and asked to see his dad's file. If he had come to me before he wrote the book, I would have showed it to him out of professional courtesy. He never asked. And so, that tells me that he started it as a scam. And I think my best impression is that he got so addicted to the attention of being a best-selling author and all the interviews and all the publicity that he came to believe his own nonsense, because he certainly believes it now. There's no question in my mind that does Steve believe that he has solved the Black Dahlia case? Yeah, Does he believe that his father was a prolific serial killer? Yeah, he believes all that stuff. I mean, there's no question in my mind that he believes all that stuff. Doesn't make it true. But I think he originally started it as a scam, knowing it was a scam. And I should point out, the publicist for this very book, right here, this very copy, this is the copy that Steve Hodel gave to Steve Lopez to write the first column about Black Dahlia Avenger. What did they say? The one person in the world we don't want to see this book is Larry Harnisch. That should tell you a lot. They knew it was bogus. They knew it was a fact. And so what is Steve? Why do you think I have the book? Steve Lopez gave it to me. And he said, look it over and tell me what you think. So, yeah, all of that tells me that Steve wrote it as a scam and then came to believe it. I think he was. I think the portrait from, and I don't remember the exact year that it was. My recollection that is it was pretty much is a couple of years before he retired, and I'm pretty sure it was in the Herald Examiner, kind of toward the end. I think that's who he was, and I think what you see now is who he is now, and I think the transformation is a combination of just Steve reinventing himself, and people do that over time. Some people will reinvent themselves, and I think that's what happened with him. But I think that, I don't think either one. I think Black Dahlia Avenger was an act. I think it was a scam. I think he believes it now. But I'm sure the Steve Hodel you see today, that's the real Steve, and the Steve Hodel in that portrait from, as I said, it's in the 80s sometime. That's legit. That's genuine. And the transformation from one personality to another, I can't answer that. That's way before. I didn't encounter Steve until 2003. So I have zero knowledge of Steve before that. I do know that certain well-known former homicide detectives who worked the O.J. Simpson case have said, what happened to Steve Hodel? What happened to the guy? I do know that I have been told that. The transformation of Steve Hodel from that guy to this guy is, I can't answer how that happened, but it's a factor. I mean, what you see then is real, and what you see now is real. Okay, let's see. Nothing over on Instagram here. Am I going to mention George Hodel in the book at all? Oh, yeah. I definitely will. Just in passing. Some people have said, well, you ought to do a chapter on George, and maybe I will in the third part of the book. As I said, the first part of the book is the life of Elizabeth Short. That's done. I'm working on the death of Elizabeth Short, which is the crime investigation. I'm working on that now. And then the third part is the myth. And I might get into it with that. Maybe. I haven't decided yet. How much has the Steve Hodel books provided impetus for you to write your own book? It's just the opposite. I was working on a book before Steve came along, and just sort of for background, I did a story for the LA Times on the 50th anniversary of the Black Dahlia killing, which was in January of 1997. And I went out and interviewed everybody I could find who was still alive. And at that point, there were a number of people. I interviewed the woman who found the body. I interviewed the first police officer on the scene. I interviewed one of the detectives who was loaned to the case. I interviewed Will Fowler, who was totally unhelpful and lied to me constantly, but that's another story. So I'm actually ahead of Steve. Steve jumped in a few years later and came up with these, hey, I found these photographs in my dead dad's stuff, and that's Elizabeth Short. And no, it's not. So the book project as such precedes Black Dahlia Avenger. So it's just the other way around. I think Steve saw a good property and decided to steal it from me and, just make up a bunch of stuff. And he has the LAPD credentials. And so that's how he got his book published. So it's actually the other way around. A lot of substance abuse among police officers. Yeah, there is. There is. Drinking is really heavy. There's a lot. I have known, sadly, police officers, some of them drink a lot. They do, no question about it. Some do. It's like in the world of journalism, there are some reporters and editors who I'm not sure how it is now. I've been out of the business for almost 10 years, but there was a time when hard living just went part of the job, smoking and drinking and all, it's like, I'm not sure how much that goes now, but definitely, yeah. Let's see. Steve Hodel must have been in awe of his accomplishment, the distant father, and so felt the need at some point to knock him off his pedestal. Yeah, it's more like this, and Steve gets into it in there, and Tamar also referred to that to some extent. She alluded to it. All the Hodel kids thought that George was rich, had a lot of money, and when he died, he was going to leave them a big inheritance. Well, George Hodel had a lot of kids. He had kids, he had Duncan, and I think there was a girl as well from wife number one. He had Tamar. He had Steve and his two brothers. He had some kids in the Philippines. And I don't know what the total count is of how many children George Hodel had. But even if he had been fairly wealthy, if you divide that fortune among that many kids, there isn't much. And a certain individual sent me all of George Hodel's, wills and estate and all that other stuff. And, regardless of what Steve says, he was not the administrator of George Hodel's estate. No, Steve was not that. And none of them ended up with the bonanza that they thought they were going to get. And I think because of that, they decided, well, we're all going to cash in on dead dad, with Steve leading the charge. Steve wrote Black Dahlia Avenger. And then what happened was you have the whole Tamar branch of the family. Tamar is Steve's half sister, the one who accused George of all the sexual misconduct and stuff. Okay. They all jumped on the gravy train. Once Steve wrote Black Dahlia Avenger, Tamar incorporated that into her life story. Her daughter Fauna number one, incorporated that into her life story. And then Fauna's daughters, Rasha and Yvette, they all just jumped on the George Hodel gravy train to make money off of George Hodel. None of what they say is true. They don't remember those things. And I was going to talk about Root of Evil if I get time for that. It's all fiction. But they all jumped into that simply because Dad didn't leave them as much as they thought they deserved. And that was it. And Steve kind of, if you read, and I haven't read Black Dahlia Avenger in a long time, it makes my head explode. But I think Steve talks about how much money he was expecting to inherit from George and didn't get it. And I think that was the motivation. Let's see. We have documentaries on the history of French fries. What's the reason for Hodel's decades-long delay in tossing his trash on the fire? Does the illusion break in doc format versus a true crime book? Okay. Steve has been working on, he's been talking about a mini-series about his claims, because I Am the Night, if you saw that, it was done on TNT. That's fictional. That is highly fictionalized. But Steve has been talking about this documentary, multi-part documentary with interviews with him, and I don't know who else. It has yet to see the light of day. My working title for it is Don't Hold Your Breath. But Steve has got some sort of documentary that's going to be multiple parts. And I don't think it's ever going to get off the ground, because that's the nature of these true crime documentaries. But that supposedly is going to be Steve's magnum opus. Would be this massive, and he says somewhere something like, He's already recorded 40 hours of interviews, which is scary. But anyway, I don't think it'll ever happen. As I said, my working title for it is "Don't Hold Your Breath." But Steve has definitely talked about doing this multi-part miniseries about his dad. I don't think it'll ever happen. Is there any actual proof of George's IQ? Oh, thank you for asking. Yes, there is, and no, there isn't. George Hodel was part of the Lewis Terman experiment. Okay, Lewis Terman was an experimenter at Stanford. He put the Stanford and Stanford Binet, the IQ tests, and so George Hodel, young George, was part of that. Okay, so yes. Now the results of the Lewis Terman tests are online if you know where to look. And I was pointed to them by a helpful individual. I get help from people who want to steer me in the direction to debunk Steve. There's a lot of people out there who want to debunk Steve. And this individual was a researcher on IQ tests and the Lewis Terman study. And he pointed me toward the raw data from the Lewis Terman IQ study. And unfortunately, all of that data is on computer punch cards. And so you have to know, I don't know if anybody these days has even seen a computer punch card, but they're about, yay by yay, computer punch card. And it's nothing but holes. And so you have to figure out, okay, this hole means this and this hole means that. Anyway, the short answer, the answer is that George Hodel, we do have George Hodel's actual IQ score, and it was more like, I think, 150. I'm relying on my memory, but Steve has inflated it by about 30 points. Now, I will question the whole validity of IQ tests. I think they're race biased, especially in the time that George Hodel was taking them. I think they were biased ethnically and racially, and so what they really indicate is maybe not as helpful. I think George Hodel was a smart guy. I don't think that's open to debate, but Steve's claim that George Hodel's IQ was higher than Einstein's. Well, no, Einstein never took an IQ test, so that's bullshit from day one. And then Steve has inflated it, and he keeps saying that, even though it is disproved with a lot of labor. I mean, you really have to go through these computer punch cards in some depth. It's nobody hands you this stuff. And as I said, when you're researching the life of George Hodel, independently of what Steve claims, you are in for a lot of pick and shovel work. It's a lot of digging, but you can find stuff. You can find the course offerings when George Hodel was in medical school. You can see how many hours he took of surgery, and you will find that it's what every medical school graduate took, exactly those many hours for surgery. That was it. So there's nothing unusual about it at all. But it's, if you're really going to independently fact check George, you're signing up for a lot of pick and shovel work. Let's see. Steve Hodel says he received a full set of autopsy photos from Harry Hansen's daughter. He does say that. Do you think the photos on page 551 of BDA? I'm not sure that's in. This is a first edition. Oh. This book doesn't go to page 551. It must be one of the 5,000 other editions of Black Dahlia Avenger that Steve Hodel did. Because Steve constantly issues updates and whatnot. New evidence. He's always finding new evidence. No, there are not burn marks on her back. That is false. And it is absolutely not noted in the autopsy. It's not there. And in addition to that, there was a young lady who, ditched school and ran away from home, as teenage girls will do. And she surfaced a couple of days later with a story that she had been kidnapped, and the guy who kidnapped her said, I'm going to do to you what I did to the Dahlia, and she burned herself with a cigarette. And so, as proof of that's what the kidnapper did. Okay, that's how the whole cigarette burns thing got incorporated into the Black Dahlia case. So no, there are no cigarette burns on her back. I think Harry Hansen's daughter did give. I think she gave Steve some of Harry Hansen's or all of Harry Hansen's photos. And I should point out that those photographs are around. Most of them are floating around on the internet. And the true way to tell is look at a photo from the Black Dahlia case. If there is the date, 1/15/47 or whatever, if there are the initials GL, and if there's a DR number, those are LAPD photos. If the photograph doesn't have that, it's from somewhere else, and who knows? The official LAPD photos are all marked like that. Okay, and I think pretty much all of them are on the internet at this point. So I don't have that particular edition, but I can tell you from looking at the photos, those aren't burned. She had, we know that she had moles on her back because there are a lot of descriptions before she was identified in the newspapers of she had a mole here, she had a mole there, blah, 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 and a scar, that kind of thing. Have I ever met Steve Hodel in person? I have not. I have not. The closest I came was a warning to Instagram folks. I'm going to have to say goodbye to you in a couple of minutes or the video will get eaten. The closest I came to meeting Steve Hodel was a personal appearance at the Glendale Public Library. And it was intended to be a confrontation. They were going to call him out. I went there with Ed Jokish, retired captain of Wilshire Division. And he was going to call out Steve and also the family of Thad Brown, because Steve accuses Thad Brown of a cover-up. And so this was going to be Thad Brown's family and Ed Jokish confronting Steve about his lies in Black Dahlia Avenger. And the person hosting the event shut them all down. We're not interested in controversy. All we want is for, Steve Hodel, buy my books. That's it. And so that is the closest I ever came. I was there. I did hear his presentation, but that's it. So that's the closest I came. Let's see. Do I know if anyone from the Hodel family has bolted and said this whole story is bogus? No. I have heard over the years, I have heard from various members of the Hodel family. I got email from Tamar or someone claiming to be Tamar. I got email from someone claiming to be, I think it was Fauna 2. I don't think I ever heard from Fauna 1, but I did hear from Tamar's other daughter, Fauna 2. And that's all I'll say, but it was, in both instances, it was not a conversation that I wanted to pursue at all. I think the only person in the Hodel family that I know of, well, of course, let me back up. The Philippine branch of the family hates Steve. Okay, and they're very clear about that. I was in contact with the whole Philippine branch, and it was all, they were really hurt. They were really angry. I think the one who reacted the strongest was Steve's older half-brother, Duncan. Duncan was so mad with Steve over Black Dahlia Avenger, he never talked to him again. Duncan was the oldest of all. I think Duncan was the oldest of all the Hodel children, and he testified on behalf of his father when George was on trial on Tamar's allegations. Duncan testified about Tamar. So, and there is some bad blood in the Hodel family over Black Dahlia Avenger. And even Tamar, I'm told, was angry with Steve for what he published. Let's see. Let's see. Be very interested to see what book or updates he publishes when your book is released. Helen, I don't think Steve is going to live that long. You know, and I say that somewhat facetiously, but okay, Steve is 10 years older than I am. Okay, I don't think he's going to be around, and I think Steve is maybe waiting to see when my book is going to drop. But as I said, I'm on part 2, which is the crime investigation. I don't think that. I honestly don't think. Again, I have. Steve is 10 years older than I am, and he has a lot of hard living under his belt that I don't have. I don't think Steve will live to see my book. I don't think so. We'll see. Only time will tell. Let's see. The paperback edition. I'm going to have to say goodbye to Instagram. Instagram, it's been great. I have to say goodbye, or Terminex has a deal for me. Okay. Goodbye, Instagram. Yeah. Okay. If I don't stop Instagram, it will just eat my video and nothing will get posted, and that would be sad. That would make Boxie sad. But anyway, so yeah. Okay. Let's see. Are there any fake with the numbers and data on them LAPD photos on the internet? How would the general public know the difference? I don't know. I don't monitor every Black Dahlia image that's out there. There are fake. People do fake images from the Black Dahlia. They do. There was a guy. You might remember. Certainly, you have seen the pictures of Elizabeth Short at John Marshall High School. They were taken by a guy. I'm relying on my memory again. It's either Glenn Kearns or Glenn Stearns. He's in the reports both ways, and I can't remember. It's one or the other. Anyway, he takes her to John Marshall High School, and Kearns. Okay, he takes some pictures of her at John Marshall High School, and there's one of them where a guy has photoshopped a cameo pin onto her dress, and then he says, "Look, I have that exact cameo." And so yeah, people do fake Black Dahlia photos for whatever reason. They do. But in terms of that, I'm not aware of any. But again, I don't monitor absolutely. I don't monitor absolutely everything. I mean, I kind of try to stay on top of what's going on in Dahlia world, because it's especially now. You've got all this other stuff going on with Skullgirls and everything else. There's a woman wrestler who calls herself Black Dahlia. It's all over the place. It's humanly impossible to monitor everything, but I do somewhat try to stay on top of it. Have I ever considered releasing the book in volumes? I thought about that, but not in a serious way. I mean, at this point, I'm just focused on writing and researching, and publication is. It's not a discussion that's ready to happen yet, because I'm still writing and I'm still finding things. You wouldn't think after 20 plus years I would still be finding things, but I am. I came across some really great information recently, and you think, well, okay, I found everything, and it's like, no, this is great stuff. You never know. You never know what's out there. You might find something else. So it's actually been good. Let's see. We're coming up on 10 o'clock. So you know what? It might be good if a dermatologist has a look. Why bother? The doctors looked at it. The medical examiner saw her back. There is no need to enter. It's Steve Hodel bullshit. There is no point to researching Steve Hodel bullshit. I can tell you for a fact, there are no cigarette burns. They're not there. If you want to, again, if you want to waste your time chasing that rabbit hole, you go right ahead. I know that there's no cigarette burns there. Okay. Last question. Steve likes to use paintings like William Culp. It's Midnight, which, yeah, you know what? Thank you for me, Mia. Steve Hodel has gotten to the point in his Crazy Steve world where he sees Hodel spelled out everywhere, and it is just hilarious. I had a running gag with a couple of other people who are also Steve Hodel skeptics of all the places that you can find Hodel spelled out, and it's in practically every painting. Every painting, every photograph, every aerial view. If you really are determined to find Hodel spelled out, you can do it. It's ridiculous. And it's, again, the fact that Steve is even willing to promote that is hilarious. So no, did George did he remain friends with Man Ray? No. Steve's claims about Man Ray, and I'll finish up right here. Steve's claims about Man Ray are generally BS. I mean, Steve will present Man Ray and he'll say, well, Man Ray was the Olin Mills of the Hodel family. No, they had a very superficial business relationship. Man Ray did take some pictures. That's true. George had some artwork by Man Ray. And after Man Ray died, George wrote to the Man Ray estate. I think he wrote to his widow to establish the provenance of these pieces so that he could value them and presumably sell them. But they were not murder buddies at all. And no one should believe a word of what Steve Hodel says about George and Man Ray being murder buddies. That's the parallel universe of Steve World. And with that, I think we are done for this. Thanks a lot, folks. It's been fun. I will do the next Black Dahlia Ask Me Anything on the first Tuesday in July, which is July 2nd. And I will do the next Ask Me Anything on George Hodel on July 16th. And so until then, we'll see you later. Right, Boxie? Oh. Okay.